warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking the time out to join us this evening, and thank you for everything that you're doing in terms of your commitment towards supporting children and young people through your roles in Academy Trust. To say, never has it been so critical as it has been over the last sort of year or so. So I just wanted to start with that recognition and thank you. So this evening is very much an overview. So it's an introductory level webinar. So we will be talking about the three core functions of governance, going into each of those three areas in a little bit more detail, but we don't have enough time, I'm afraid, to go into each one in perhaps the depth that we would like, because I know that we're all very busy, so this is very much an overview. But please do, as Graham said, use the chat function. Let's try to get out of it as much as we can possibly deliver for you in terms of areas of focus that you would like us to address. So do use that. I will keep an eye on it, and obviously I will do my best to answer everything that we can during the session. So tonight, let's just move on then to think about those effective features of multi-academy trust governance. These are the ones that you will find detailed in the Department for Education's guidance called A Competency Framework for Governance. That was first published in 2017. So there are those 6 competency areas, and sitting beneath those are various other competency areas. So we're going to touch on all 6. We're going to actually start on number 4, just because it's talking about the structure and the way in which that all comes together as a multi-academy trust. So we'll run through the wheel from section 4 onwards. So let me just give you a very brief background. So when we talk about the Academy programme, it started, in 2009, I think it was. So we had some early Pathfinder programmes where people were just starting to explore the different ways and means in which they could become free from local authority control. So it was very much about a programme that would promote freedom and accountability that goes alongside it. Obviously, responsibility always comes hand in hand with some freedoms, and therefore the programme has been evolving ever since. And you'll know that there has been several iterations of the articles, for example, and of the associated funding agreements and other documentation that goes along to support it. But it's very much a programme that still continues to evolve. And if we get the opportunity, then I'll touch on some of the ways in which that's continuing to evolve when we go through the sort of bigger picture view of how the regulatory aspect works in the education sector a little bit later. So now we've got around 50% of all schools in England are academies. I know for the Southwest, we're the largest region of academies. That's around 56%. But again, just gives you a little bit of a flavour. So tonight, our aims and objectives are very much to give you the opportunity to fulfil your roles as Academy trustees effectively and efficiently. And to do that, as I say, we are going to look in more detail at each of those areas in the competency framework. So let's just move on then to another piece of guidance, which is very much at the heart of what we do as trustees, as well as members, if you also hold a member role. Some chairs do, for example. So from the governance handbook, we're looking at those 3 core functions of governance. So those are the broad themes that we will focus on this evening. First one being ensuring clarity of vision, ethos, and strategic direction. 2 other points then about holding leaders to account. First, for the educational performance of the trust, and that's all of the schools within the trust, for its pupils in terms of outcomes, and for the performance management of staff. So in particular for trustees, we will be focused on the performance management of our Chief Executive Officer. And then finally, overseeing the financial performance of the organisation, making sure the money is well spent. As you know, we're a publicly funded organisation, and therefore there are some, I suppose, guidance as well as some statutory aspects that I'll touch on a little bit later on. So let's move on then to think about the roles and responsibilities of the board. So if I can explain that a multi-academy trust, or a single academy trust for that matter, is in fact a charitable company. So as such, it is held to account by company law and charity law. On the left-hand side, you'll see the extract from the Companies Act 2006, which talks about the statutory duties of company directors. On the right-hand side, and I apologise, it's my error for not spotting this sooner, the Charity Governance Code has been recently updated, and therefore they're now called the 6 Principles. So this has been updated. It's very broadly similar, but I just wanted to, for the point of sort of completeness and accuracy, draw your attention to the fact that that has been very recently updated. You can see that the two very much align. We're talking about making sure that we are using reasonable care, skill and diligence in everything that we do. You'll know that through the Academy Ambassadors programme, you've gone through a screening call with a regional advisor, either myself or one of my colleagues. We'll have looked at your CV in advance. There will have been those discussions about your skill sets, your experience, and making sure, therefore, that in terms of the trust's needs, that there is that clear and strong match. So very much skills orientated. So we know that you already have that diverse range of skills and experience and expertise that, along with your other trustee colleagues, will add to the table a great range of different points of view and experiences that are only going to add value when it comes to debate and decision making in the interests of children and young people. So we do want to think about value for money. We do want to think about regularity. We do want to think about proprietary. Again, when it comes to publicly funded organisations, all of those things are really important, but equally recognising that as trustees, we are jointly and severally liable for what goes on in our charitable company. I guess I just wanted to make that point because I've heard sometimes comments being made along the lines of, oh, well, I'm the finance expert. So, yes, I'll contribute when it comes to finance, but I'll leave the educational piece to others. Sorry, that's not quite how it works. Obviously, you will have particular expertise that you will contribute, and that's why you're there. But you are also equally responsible for the educational performance, and therefore, part of tonight is about highlighting to you some of the tools and the data that you can use to make sure that you have a well-informed picture of the educational performance in your trust. So, as I say, it's very much for all of us to be equally responsible for everything that happens within our trust. So if we move on to the next slide, please. We wanted to think about structure, just because it helps to clarify the different roles and responsibilities within an academy trust. So again, really important. I know when I do external reviews of governance, for example, one of the common themes that comes out is actually a lack of clarity about roles and responsibilities. And I'm sure you can imagine what that leads to in terms of perhaps duplication, sometimes a lack of understanding about what's happening in other parts of the governance structure. But again, it very much promotes the opportunity of teamwork and making sure that the people with the right skills are sitting in the right places. So I'm going to take it from sort of the top down, and I say that with a slight hesitation, because one of the things that, again, comments that usually come up from local governors in particular, is that it seems very hierarchical. It is, but I would also encourage everybody to think about it in a sort of front to back, so sort of like this, where the members are sitting at the back and the front facing parts of the governance structure are very much at the local level, because they will be involved in a particular school, whereas everybody else is dealing with the trust and all schools within the trust as a whole. So let me just break that down a little bit for you, first of all. So members have a very distinctly different role to the Board of Trustees. So in essence, they act as the guardians to the Constitution. So by the Constitution, I mean the Articles of Association. They have a number of statutory roles and responsibilities. They do have quite a bit of power attached to the role. They can choose to fold the whole organisation and clear the board if they so choose, and reappoint new ones. Again, they have the power to appoint the external auditors, although that can be delegated down to the Board of Trustees if they wish to. They also are there to receive the audited accounts each year. And that's because it's the board that actually signs them off and does the approvals, but they will have the duty to observe and scrutinise and make sure that they are satisfied that obviously the trust is a going concern, but their knowledge around statutory accounts, for example, is a particularly helpful skill set to have at your member level. Now, I would say it's been a little bit of a confusion in terms of the role. I don't think that on the whole, members have necessarily fully understood their roles and responsibilities. So they are expected to meet formally once every year through the annual general meeting. Usually the order of business is actually quite short. So I would always recommend you thinking about adding to the annual general meeting a session that is perhaps an informal one, straight after the formal business has been concluded, by which perhaps your CEO could do a look back at the successes of the year that's just passed, and perhaps the chair of the board could think about the look forward and what is it that you want to bring it to the attention of all your stakeholders about the performance and the priorities going forward into the next academic year and or beyond. So broadly speaking, that's the members. There is a minimum requirement of 3. The Department for Education has a very strong preference for there to be 5. So they like an odd number, and they most definitely do like separation of roles. So the vast majority of members should be only members. Typically, if anyone's going to have a dual role, it would be your chair of trustees that would also be a member. Not always. You can have completely separate functions within the members and trustees, but if anyone's going to overlap, it's quite often the chair. So let's leave that there then for members and move on to the Board of Trustees. And basically, in terms of accountability, this is where the buck stops. So, which is why it's really important that trustees and everybody else sitting in the governance framework does understand their roles and responsibilities. So they are the ones that are going to oversee the performance of the trust overall, both educationally and financially. Again, a minimum of 3. There is no stated maximum in the articles usually. However, they may give a proportion that are appointed by members. Obviously, others can be co-opted for their skill sets. You may or may not have your Chief Executive Officer also becoming a trustee. It is up to them to decide whether they would like to or not, but also that is a conversation for the board. There is a growing voice, I guess, in terms of whether that's appropriate or not. And I certainly know from working in governance roles in other sectors, usually the CEO and the CFO are automatically board members, but that isn't necessarily the case everywhere else. And that's again about accountability. So the Board of Trustees, as I say, they are the ones that are going to have the overarching responsibility for the trust and its performance, and they will be the ones that will be answerable in the first regard to the regulators, and we'll talk more a little bit about there. So I can see a question popping up there. How strongly does the DFE feel about the CEO being a trustee or not? They haven't expressed a clear view on it as far as I'm aware. I am aware of recent media articles around one particular school that had a little bit of an issue arise as a result of one CEO advocating quite strongly that they should be a trustee, and as a result the rest of the board resigned. That is unusual. So the Department for Education, in working with the Charity Commission and setting out the model articles, do allow for the CEO to become a trustee if that is mutually agreed. But I think it's going to be one of those conversations that will continue to evolve. I certainly feel that I started working in governance, basically in the social housing sector, 2003, 2004, and you can start to see how things evolve over time. Obviously in the education sector, we're sort of 10, 20 years behind that. And therefore there are some similarities, I think, in terms of some of the conversations that will come about, but yet to be seen is what I would say to that. Do the members need to elect a chair? I've seen a growing emergence of a chair of members role in some MATs. They typically do. And I think that's a good idea, that somebody is nominated as the chair, and that's an appointed role, perhaps for a 1-year term of office. It can be reviewed annually. So I would say, yes, that is an appropriate thing. It's not something that you'll see stipulated in the articles. It is for the board, but not for the members. But I would say that's certainly the best way forward. Okay, so let's move on then. In terms of the 2 other committees, which are in dark blue, they are trust committees. They are distinctly different because their remit is trust-wide. So again, it will be finance for all of the schools within that trust, and HR staffing for all of the schools in the trust. They can be called a range of different things. Some have them as the Audit, Finance and Risk Committee. It's fine to combine them. If you're a smaller committee, there are stipulations once you're over a certain size for that to have to be separate. But again, the important point with those types of committees, trust committees I call them, is that the membership of them must be made up by the majority of trustees. So what that means is, if you happen to have at a local advisory committee level somebody that had HR expertise, you could invite them to attend and be a member of the trust HR committee, as long as the vast majority are trustees. So that's the only real stipulation to watch out for in that regard. And again, it's a policy decision for you to determine what the size of those committees are. Mostly the Board of Trustees is around sort of 10 to 12, thereabouts. Obviously it does vary. They do typically talk about smaller skilled boards, but again, I also know from a practical perspective, particularly when you're in larger organisations, if you then have subcommittees, you need a certain number to ensure that they are quorate. Obviously, if you're relying on a very small number of trustees, that can run into difficulties when somebody is suddenly absent. And of course, through the pandemic, we've seen a lot of different pressures coming on people, both in their professional capacity as well as their voluntary capacity. So it is very much a practical consideration. Now we've then got, showing at the bottom, the local advisory committees. Now they can be called all sorts of different things. So it could be a local governing body. I've seen some calling them local governing boards. I would advise you to stay away from local governing boards, because again, when it comes to understanding clearly the different roles and responsibilities, it causes some confusion. For schools that were maintained and were standalone, when you talk about them being the board, they understand what that means, and then suddenly they are a committee of the Academy Trust Board of Trustees. So local governing committee, local governing body committee, I would always make sure the committee word is in there, because it helps to establish more clearly what their remit is, and it's very much a particular school remit. Although there are options. If you look at the middle box, there is one local advisory committee here for 2 schools. There could be very good reasons why you do that. If they're very small schools, that could be something that you might want to consider. If you've got a brand new build school and you want to partner those brand new governors with an established governing body committee that works well, then you might want to do that. You might also want to group them very differently. For example, you can group all primaries together if you're in a very small trust, obviously not when you're working at scale. and you can have one committee overseeing a number of secondary schools. So you could do it by phase, you could do it by geography, and again there can be a tier between the local advisory committees and the trust committees when you become bigger, because you would then start to think about regional oversight. So again, it will evolve. There's no right or wrong answer when it comes to structure. It's very much about context. So Helen, where would C of E and diocesan representatives sit within the structure, or is their role typically advisory? And that depends. They could literally be all through it, Helen. So so at the moment, for example, I'm the interim head of governance in the Diocese of Salisbury Academy Trust. So again, their rules are that they have to have the majority that are determined as foundation trustees or foundation governors. So they literally do sit in every tier. So it very much depends on your trust and its makeup, and therefore the articles should reflect in it, if you're a faith organisation, or whether you're a mixed multi-academy trust for that matter, what the proportion should be in relation to diocesan or C of E representatives. So the diocese itself would typically be a corporate member, for example. So as I say, that's very particular sets of circumstances relating to sort of faith matters, usually speaking. So it does vary. Sorry, Helen, it's not sort of a strict sort of answer. It does vary. So let's move on then in terms of just thinking a little bit about public scrutiny. Simply because what we've started to touch upon, and as I said earlier, things do evolve continually. You know, there will be examples of where poor governance has had a negative impact. Thankfully, in the education sector, they are few and far between. Unfortunately, even though they are few and far between, when something does happen, it generally hits the headlines. And again, unfortunately, that seems to get extrapolated in the media, that this is suddenly about all academy trusts, when actually it's about one particular academy trust. So it's a difficult one, but again, you know, we don't want to be in the headlines for the wrong reasons, which is why understanding the corporate nature of your charitable company, the fact that you are governed by charity and company law, that you are guided by the Academy's financial handbook, the funding agreements, and your articles. Those are all important statutory elements of your role that you need to be aware of, and that helps to prevent this kind of sort of press headlines. Definitely not ones that we want to see, but as I say, being publicly funded, then we do need to have that transparency. So let's move on then, if I may, to the accountability piece, because I think when you're talking about the sector as a whole, it's quite helpful to understand who else is looking in at your trust. So you can see the map on the left there is very much showing you the 8 regions, the Department for Education regions. Now that's helpful in a lot of ways, but there are different local authority areas that sit within each of those regions, and Ofsted's focus changes, the diocese regions change as well. So this is just showing you a map of the Department for Education's 8 regions, where they have 8 regional schools commissioners. So the Department for Education is the regulator of all academy trusts and free schools. You contract as an academy trust with the Department for Education through your funding agreement. So as a multi-academy trust, you will have a master funding agreement, and for every school in your trust, you will have a supplemental funding agreement. If you've never looked at them, I would urge you to do that as a piece of reading, not word by word, or page by page, but most definitely look at the headlines, look at the statutory responsibilities that are set out in those documents. So it'll be things around special educational needs, for example, and disabilities. It will be around things like admissions. So again, just get an awareness for what is stipulated in your master funding agreement. So The master funding agreement and everything to do with money and in fact governance is closely regulated by a executive agency of the Department for Education called the Education and Skills Funding Agency. So do notice I said finance and I said governance. So if there are concerns of a financial nature, typically they go hand in hand with poor financial governance, which is why the ESFA will intervene if there are queries and concerns arising from perhaps late submissions of statutory returns, or if there is a sudden emergency cash flow request made. You know, those kinds of things are all triggers for intervention and closer scrutiny. So, you know, the importance of your board overseeing financial performance as well as educational performance is really critical. The other part of the Department for Education then are those regional schools commissioners, and they focus predominantly on the educational performance. That also brings into play governance, so they do work closely with the Education and Skills Funding Agency. And clearly Ofsted is a separate organisation, but if Ofsted were to find one of your schools or more than one of your schools in an inadequate category, then again, that's another trigger for the Regional Schools Commissioner to intervene. So just well worth being aware, basically, of who those sort of regulatory kinds of stakeholders are that will be keeping a close eye on different aspects of your trust's performance. One of the things that is good is that the Regional Schools Commissioners, in normal times, I think, to be fair, some of them have been put on pause just due to the pandemic, they usually have an annual trust review with every single academy trust in their region. Usually speaking, it's the CEO and the chair of the board that attends them. And they are critical meetings by which the Regional Schools Commissioner assesses how au fait your board chair is with the educational performance of your trust and its schools. Typically speaking, the Regional Schools Commissioner or one of their officers will direct the very first question of the meeting to the board chair. So just be alert to that. That can be expected. So you would need to make sure that obviously you do a little bit of homework and reliant on your CEO. So again, having a little bit of a pre-meeting briefing is probably a good idea, so that you're making sure that you're signed up to the same messages about performance. So Julian, your question about reserves, I'll come back to that in a bit. Do remind me if I don't, but I will try and get back to that when we come on to the financial bit in a little moment, if that's all right. So that's probably all I need to say in terms of the regulatory side of things. I'm going to start focusing in a little bit more then on the educational side, if we may. So in terms of that second part of the accountability of educational performance, so just the sort of key principles, there's a number of different pieces of data. I'll talk you through some of those in a second, but just in terms of core principles, what every trustee needs to try to understand is first and foremost, basically the difference between progress and attainment. So attainment basically are your results, the actual grades that pupils will get in their SAT, so statutory assessment tests for primary age children, and obviously Key Stage 4 or GCSE and A-level results for older children. Progress data, when you get progress data, always make sure you're clear about the baseline, i.e. their starting point. And again, you'll realise with the pandemic how critically important that is at the moment, given that we are completely reliant on internal teacher assessment at this point in time, because we didn't have last year in 2020 any external exams, and neither will we have them again this year. So I'll talk to you in a moment about the 2019 with the last set of externally taken tests that we will be using to draw some kind of comparison with, because it gives us that much bigger picture of what's happening nationally, and that's really critical. But however you get your data presented to you, please make sure that you are clearly being told where pupils started, where they should end up if they are going to make progress in line with their prior attainment. So, you know, starting right from sort of primary through sort of the early years and foundation stage, through Key Stage 1, through Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5. Depending where they start, there will be a trajectory basically of expected levels of progress for their age at primary level in particular. So you're going to be wanting to make sure that you can see that they are on track to at least meet expected levels of progress. Obviously, if they're going to exceed and we want to push them, that's fantastic, but you will also want to be pointing out where children are not on track, and you'll need to know why that is the case, what intervention is going in place there in order to accelerate their progress and get them at least back on track with their age related expectations and or exceeding. So we'll talk more about Ofsted in a moment, but the important thing I would say to you, and I'm a big fan of a dashboard type approach to data, where you will want to think about what are normally the published key measures. So whether you're primary or secondary or both, you will need to be clear what are the normal measures, and we'll start looking at that in just a second, so that you have on sort of one page of A4 basically an overview, and things like using RAG rating red, amber, green is really very helpful because it will immediately show to you where you need to focus your attention, you know, where things are not on track. The other important point there, and it's again incredibly important, particularly because of the pandemic, to triangulate your data. Again, where things often fall down is where the board will be completely reliant on the use of internal data only. You do need to be using other sources of data. You do need to be thinking about your monitoring and evaluation activity. That can still happen virtually. You don't need to have visits into school in order to monitor and evaluate how things are going against your strategic plan, but you do need to be doing that. If you can't do that, and that's fine, if you know, professional workload means that that's not possible, then again, how else could you do that? You could be commissioning, for example, an external school improvement partner that, again, they called all sorts of different names, could be an education specialist, you know, whatever, but there would be somebody else who is an education professional that can come in independently, look objectively at where children are and help to report back to the board so that you can triangulate and see whether they are picking up the same areas of strength and areas for development that you're being told from an internal data and reporting perspective. So really, really important. So let's just have a look then on the next slide at some examples of sort of data as we start to sort of move through. So, for example, this is an extract from the DFE performance tables. Again, really, really important source of information for you. So please do make a note of that. All of these slides will be shared with you afterwards. There is more supplementary information provided in the annex at the back. We won't be going into the detail of it today, but there is more information there for you, just so you've got it at your fingertips. Okay, so what I'm looking at then is secondary performance here. It's Key Stage 4. All right, this one happens to be 2018. So just a few pointers of things to be looking out for particularly. One is always the number of pupils at the end of that key stage. So when it comes to then percentages, I've got a much better sense in my own mind as to how much value each student has, basically. Obviously, smaller numbers can have a bigger disproportionate effect, if you like. in terms of sort of the numbers. So you really do need to be clear, how many pupils are we actually talking about? Now, when it comes to Progress 8, that's one of the key measures that is published, so that is definitely one that you want to see. You're ideally looking for 0, which means that they have met basically their expected levels of progress. So anything that's above a plus sign is obviously more than expected levels of progress. That's fantastic. That's ideally where we want to be. Anything that's a minus score, again, you want to be looking into that to see where they are. Now, in terms of the national average, can you see at the bottom of the column, that Progress 8 column, it says England state-funded schools, and it's got minus 0.02, which is the same score as the first school. So what that's saying is it's actually meeting national average in terms of progress. But we have got other schools which go into the red. So now all of a sudden, Apple Academy, for example, is minus 1.17, well below average. Now, that gives you the reason to ask questions. It doesn't tell you the answers, but it gives you the reason to prompt and probe for more information. Now, what was the context of this academy? Was it perhaps that your trust has just taken in a school that had previously been a standalone maintained school that was either judged requires improvement or inadequate? You know, is it that kind of context? It may not be, but it's the kind of thing that you might be wanting to sort of ask questions about. So, you know, what is the reason for that progress? Because when it comes to attainment, and if you look further to the right across the headings there, for example, grade 5 or above in English and Maths GCSEs, that's a key measure that, again, all of these are published measures. You have grade 5, which is called a strong pass, and you have a grade 4, which is called a good pass. So you want to, so the grade 5 obviously being the higher one. So if we look at this, and we can see that in the example school, the first row, we've got 36% of those particular pupils have achieved grade 5 or above in both English and Maths. Again, look to the bottom of the column and just look at the statistics that we have there, and you can see that that is below national average. So what you need to be thinking about there is, okay, they're on track in terms of progress. You know, again, what was their starting point? Did the pupils at this school come in, because we're talking about secondary, did they come in from primary school with below average attainment at the end of Key Stage 2, at the end of primary level in Year 6? And again, you'll be wanting to start to think about the context for this particular school and this particular cohort of students. But again, the benefit is that obviously over time you build up a picture of each and every cohort, and they are very different, and you'll get a much better understanding of why the scores and the outcomes are as they are for schools in your trust. But that gives you some kind of flavour of a bit of a dashboard. Can I just ask you then, and again, put this in the chat if you would please, or feel free to put your hand up, and let me know, how does data get presented to you, and are you finding it easy to understand and you know, get to grips with the position that your schools are performing in terms of their education? Give me some thoughts. I'd be interested to see what you're working with. Now, I'm sorry, I can't see everybody on my screen because the slide is taking it up. So I think I will have to ask you to default to using the chat facility, because I can see that. Make sure I don't want to miss anybody or overlook you if you've asked a question. So, okay, Dawn, you haven't seen any yet, that's fine. Again, it'd be useful for you just to sort of keep these points in mind when you get to your first meeting, and just see, you know, what you're being presented with. Is it clear and understandable? Don't forget, whilst obviously in terms of the skills of trustees, you want somebody around the table that's got the educational expertise other than your CEO. But, you know, most of you probably won't have an educational background. So it's really important that there is a conversation between the board and the chief exec about how data is presented to make it accessible to you. Okay, so some are obviously still waiting for a performance update. That's fine. Adam's got something similar. That's great. For high-level summaries, yeah, absolutely. So don't forget, as a multi-academy trust board in particular, you are looking for that high-level summary, which is why I said the dashboard is such a good tool to use. But clearly, as Adam says, if he then wants to delve into more information, then having that available is helpful too. But again, if you think about that structure diagram chart that we looked at earlier, and remember I said at the bottom row was the local governors. It's their job to do the detailed scrutiny of data for that particular school. So you must be, as a board, confident that you've got people with the right skill sets and expertise in those local governing body committees that are equipped to do the job that you're asking them to do. Make sure they've got proper induction, proper training, so they can do that, because you're going to be reliant on that. You know, you're relying on them asking the questions and providing the challenge. So again, you know, you do need to make sure you're looking at those minutes from time to time, or your governance professional is, to get a proper gauge as to how well they're doing their jobs. What you don't want is a nasty surprise coming when suddenly there's a poor Ofsted outcome. So what have we got? David. Hi, David. Only just started, but presented an Excel spreadsheet with a summarised dashboard. Okay, that's good. That's good. That sounds as though that's going to work nicely for you. Karen, yeah, your schools are for SEND pupils. So again, yeah, I understand it. And again, you will see, for example, in data like this, quite typically well below average in special educational needs schools. So again, it's about understanding the context for your cohort of pupils, given that if it's in a special educational needs trust with special educational needs schools, very often there's a very broad range of complex needs of those children. So again, you need to be thinking about comparing like with like, not necessarily other mainstream schools. So again, that context is really important, I would say. Thank you for that. That's really good to get a sense of. So let's just move on then, if we may, to the second part. This is also from the DFE performance tables. So Progress X score, again, just presented slightly differently, but you can start to see immediately where your school sits and where the England average is. I personally don't pay much regard to the local authority average. If the local authority average is low, I'm just not interested. I'm looking for the national average to compare against. So that's what I would suggest to you with that. Let's whip on to the next slide quickly, because I say there's nothing very different about that. It was just presented differently, basically. Okay, so now we have primary academies. And again, in between the type of school and the percentage of pupils meeting the expected standard, you would normally see a column which tells you again the number of pupils in that academy, and as we've already said, that is quite critical. The expected standard, what do they mean by that? If you've met the expected standard, basically you will have a scaled score of 100 in each of the 3 subjects, reading, writing and maths. So what we're saying is basically how many pupils in that academy have met that standard. Now again, you can see quite a wide range of different outcomes in one particular trust, and say there's likely to be a story behind all of that data, but you can clearly see that we've got some schools in this particular trust where they've got some real expertise by the looks of things in terms of well above average results. So again, I would be wanting to find out, well, how is the teaching and learning in that school and the best practice being shared with other practitioners in other academies across the trust? So, you know, it's that kind of conversation you would be wanting to think about. But again, you know, not necessarily going into the ins and outs of this, but you do always want to be thinking about the number or the percentage of pupils achieving at a higher standard too. What that doesn't show you on there is another key measure which is published, which is the combined score for reading, writing and maths. So that's an important one to focus in on, as is spelling, punctuation and grammar. That's another one that's a good indicator to keep track of. So let's move on, because I say the principles are exactly the same for primary and secondary. What I've got here is a little bit of an extract for you. Again, I'm just trying to show you other sources of data that you can use. So remember I said about triangulating internal data. So I've showed you the DFE performance tables. This is something called the Inspection Data Dashboard Summary. Have I got that? I've not said that right now, have I? Inspection Data Summary Report, even, IDSR. That's it. I would keep the abbreviation more closely in my mind. This is actually something that's published by through the DFE sign-in. You won't typically have a DFE sign-in access or login code, but your CEO and head teachers most certainly will. So they will be able to pull this data off for you. It is the data that, I suppose the name gives it away, Inspection Data Summary Report, that Ofsted will use. It is historical, so, you know, always bear that in mind. But the first page, the extract in the top left, is the extract from the first page. So it tells you, you don't need to work it out, it will tell you straight away where you need to be focusing in for this particular school. So again, for your governors, this is a really useful piece of data, albeit historic. So again, you can see when it starts to break down the 3-year trend, again, it's building up a picture if you're new into the governance roles and getting a sense for where all of your schools are. Gives you a bit of a feel as to where they are by looking whether they're sort of significantly above national or not, as the case may be. So again, just reasons for you to start asking questions more than anything else. Just two other things that I just draw to your attention in terms of data. I don't have examples for you here tonight. There's something called the Education Endowment Foundation that are particularly focused in on disadvantaged pupils. They have a dashboard, data dashboard, which is called the Families of Schools database. So you can ask for that for your particular trust and schools in your trust. It's free to use, so you can go straight into that yourself if you wanted to. Look for the Families database. It comes under Practical Tools heading. And you can see then, in terms of particularly sort of disadvantaged outcomes against other peers, that's detailed quite clearly for you. The other popular one is something called Fisher Family Trust, and again quite well presented in terms of sort of dashboards and use of colour that helps to more clearly show you, I guess, where to focus in. So that's certainly something, again, I would encourage you to think about. So there are a range of different sources of data. Let's move on then, if we may, to the financial bit, the last sort of main section really. Just to draw to your attention that the ESFA will issue letters periodically to your accounting officers. Your accounting officers are your chief executive officers, and they will talk to you about particular areas of focus or particular updates, and they will give you updates in terms of statutory reporting deadlines. The deadlines last year, for example, were mostly extended due to the pandemic. They are supposed to be copied to your chair of the board, but I would also make sure that you get sight of these letters, and members in actual fact. So all of the board and all of the members ideally should see these letters. Moving on, if we may, please. So what we've got now are extracts from the Academy's Financial Handbook. Again, this is a must read for all of you. So if you haven't already had a look at it, please make sure that you do. I would draw your attention to Schedule 8. which is basically a summary at the very back, which is called the Schedule of Musts. It's about 5 pages and very succinctly tells you in a nutshell what all your statutory roles and responsibilities are. So probably not a surprise, you must maintain robust oversight of your finances in the Academy Trust, and the board will take full responsibility for stewardship of all assets and the use of resources, both human and financial, in order to make sure outcomes for pupils are focused in on. You must have a written scheme of financial delegation. You should have a scheme of delegation. Again, that's a statutory requirement. It must be published on your trust website, but there should be a section around financial powers and financial KPIs too. So the question we had earlier, before I forget, you were talking about reserves. Should schools be carrying large reserves or not? No, basically. It is obviously always prudent to have some reserves. Most boards will have a reserves forward, something that would be equivalent to a month or two's total expenditure, so that they can always have that sort of as a bit of a contingency. I will tell you that when the ESFA has looked at schools that have had difficulty or challenge for whatever reason, and they've seen big levels of reserves, that's not viewed very well at all, because the money is given for those pupils to be spent on their education. So we all know that there are practical reasons why, you know, for poor state of buildings or capital works, you know, there are sometimes, you know, good reasons why you would need to keep reserves, of course, but generally speaking, no. Okay, so let's move on then. I say I'm going to whip through those quite quickly because they are very much all about the Academy's financial handbook. So again, internal controls, really important. 2 main things. You have your internal audit and you have external audit. Please make sure as a board that those processes are in place and that the programme of audit is already sort of set out, so you know what's happening when, what are the areas of focus for the internal audit in particular. They can be outsourced to, quite often local authorities have independent internal auditors that can provide that kind of assurance. But again, if you don't know who your internal auditors are, then that's a good question to ask. So moving on. So funding, quite a complex thing in terms of funding in academies. I guess, you know, quite a bit to sort of say on that. Just a few things to be thinking about. For example, your local authority has responsibility for what's called the high needs budget. So where in a mainstream setting, you have children with an education, health and care plan or special educational needs, some monies will be allocated to them if they've got the education and healthcare plan, monies to support delivery of education to meet those particular needs. But it is determined by the local authority rather than the government or by you as a trust. So again, it's quite important that you keep abreast of what changes there might be to the high needs budget in particular. Things like census dates are really critical. 2 census dates every year, one in October, one in the spring. So you need to make sure that the pupil numbers that are submitted for those census are accurate, because your funding will be based on them for the next year. So it's always received 1 year, a sort of lagged funding, 1 year behind the pupils' numbers that you gave, if that makes any sense. There are a number of different grants. Pupil Premium is just one of them. There's a Year 7 Literacy and Numeracy Catch-up Fund, obviously just the secondary. In primary, there are sports and PE grants. So there's a Service Premium grant for children of service families, MOD or military families. It can really add up. So current payments at the moment is £1,320 per pupil at a primary age. and £935 per annum for a secondary age child. There will be additional payments from local authorities for anybody that is classified as a local, a looked after child, so basically looked after by the local authority. And there's a £310 payment for service children, as well as those other grants that I mentioned. All of them come with some criteria. All of them require you as a trust to publish a strategy for how you're going to spend that money each year, and to provide an evaluation at the year end so that you can see the impact of the spend of that money. So do be aware of that. Capital funding is based on pupil numbers and phase. So Academy Trusts basically get a lump sum, but you can also, on top of that, apply for a Condition Improvement Fund, or SIF fund, to help support funding for particular capital building projects. With each SIF round of bids, there is an area of focus for the department at that particular moment in time. Do make sure from your point of view that there is sufficient separation of roles for the accounting officer and the chief financial officer. So the chief financial officer should also have direct access to the board and report to you, as well as the chief exec, who is also the accounting officer. The accounting officer, just important to remember that they have a personal liability to government for best use of that funding, essentially. So let's think about people as the last little bits. So Academy's financial handbook I've touched on. Financial framework then, sorry, people. Yes, we've talked about that particular publication, and say do look at that. Last things about people, essentially. So obviously you as the board are the strategic leadership of the trust. It is for the CEO to lead the executive and other staffing team to implement your strategy, and to make sure that the policies align with the strategy and the ethos of the trust. The executive leadership team, executive management team, they can be called different things, usually comprised of those most senior leaders that have trust-wide leadership roles. It may or may not include head teachers of individual schools. Do just bear in mind when it comes to pay that most trusts adopt what's called the Standard Teachers Pay and Conditions document. It changes every year, but again, that's how you set the gradings in terms of your pay policy. So again, worth you just being mindful of that, because that document has already been discussed and agreed with trade unions. So then you don't have to do that. You know, you're sort of quite safe that those scales are nationally recognised, which helps, I think, when teachers in particular change jobs between trusts, that there is that sort of common understanding about pay. One thing for the board to remember in terms of accountability for the CEO in particular is to make sure that the performance management process is completed by the 31st of December annually. So you want to be setting up that timetable, which starts in the autumn term with a look back at the previous year, how well they met the objectives or not, as the case may be, and if appropriate, then a review of pay. It can then be obviously about setting targets for the new academic year. There will be a mid-year performance review around Easter, and then again the end of year back in the autumn. So do also be mindful in terms of the pandemic, and obviously issues of workload and stress, well-being, as well as the ongoing things around teacher recruitment and retention, and the high level of scrutiny that is applied to things like executive pay in particular. So I'm very conscious we are at 6 o'clock, so I'm going to very quickly try and run through the last couple of slides for you. So one of the things that I would talk to you about is the standards in public life, so the Nolan principles. When I referred to that first document to you, the Competency Framework for Governance, that has got those principles listed within it as a core expectation of everybody in the boardroom, that you behave in that way, because as I've said already, there is external scrutiny, and therefore there are high expectations of everybody's conduct. Moving on, just in terms of accountability and challenge, you know, please make sure that you get the balance right between providing support and providing evidence-based challenge. That is your job. You do it respectfully, you do it with evidence in front of you, but it is your job to do the challenge piece, not just the support piece. Moving on, just in terms of compliance, I've talked to you already about the main aspects of compliance that affect you and your roles in relation to the articles: charity law, company law, education law, funding agreements. So those are the main areas, but do think about those wider stakeholders. So for example, clearly parents, as well as your staff, as well as your pupils, as well as the regulators, as well as other stakeholders. It could be the diocese. So think about that bigger framework within which you are operating. But as I've said, in terms of the statutory things, if you look at that schedule of musts at the back of the Academy's financial handbook, they'll be listed there for you. Last one then is just in terms of evaluations, not an exercise for us to do now, but it is a set of 10 points that came out as part of a Department for Education piece of guidance called Maths Good Practice Guidance and Expectations for Growth, published in what, 2016 I think, but still regarded as really pertinent questions. So one thing that I would ask you to think about, many of you were indicating that you're quite new in post, is just to keep those 10 questions under review and see over the next few months how well you think your trust is performing against those 10 points. So just to wrap then, we have looked at very quickly the features of effective governance. As I say, do look at the competency framework for governance. All details and more are in that. In terms of next steps, there are a few items of sort of essential reading for you. So on the next slide, things like the articles, scheme of delegation, strategic plan, annual accounts, Dear Accounting Officer letters. Look at your DFE performance tables, look at the financial benchmarking data, which you can get from a link from the DFE performance table. So it's all through the one site. That brings us to an end. So as I said, it is a bit of an overview, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, giving you a few pointers to look out for. I hope that helps to some degree. David, I'll come back to you separately if you like on your question, just to make sure that I don't miss anything off there. But thank you so much for your time and everything that you're doing as trustees. I'm going to hand you back to Graham.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for that, and thank you all for joining this evening. I hope you found that a useful introduction to governance. I'll send these slides tomorrow, so look out for that in your email, and including all links to resources, and we'll also be seeking some feedback about the event. But that's it for tonight. So thanks again, and hope to see you at another event soon.
Thank you, everyone.